Mr. Speaker, the starting point for today's debate has to be that the absolute prohibition of certain illegal drugs arbitrarily chosen has failed in New Zealand. We absolutely think that people have generally free access to drugs like marijuana and like methamphetamines. I'm sure that all of you in this room, if you really wanted marijuana, you would know who to ask to get marijuana, right? We realise that even people like Simon nodding at the back, who's a first year from Otago, Edison, could figure out who to ask if he wanted marijuana. So we think these drugs are freely available. But we also say, obviously, that, these are the harms you've all heard before. There are dangers associated with forcing Simon to go through the black market. He can't guarantee the purity of those drugs, but also the fact that he has to come into contact with criminals who might rip him off and say, that's all very dangerous. It would be much better if Simon could gain safe access to those drugs. But what we also say on this side of the House is that there are harms associated with full legalisation. And on this side of the House, what we support is empowering local communities to deal with drug legalisation and drug regulation in their own areas. We think that's going to be the best way to monitor it. And what we want to do is to allow local communities to have the full range of regulatory options surrounding rules around both the sale and the possession of drugs. We will put an upper limit on how much they can sell, so you're not going to be able to buy like truckloads and truckloads, but we'll allow them to in the state law, you'll be allowed to buy as much as you could sensibly use for your personal use. We're also willing to regulate possession, right? We're not going to set up checkpoints between like Wellington and the Kapiti Coast, but if you do take marijuana up to the Kapiti Coast and all the grannies that have retired up there don't want marijuana to be legal, you get pulled over in your car and the police find you with marijuana, there will be some small penalty attached to that action if that's what the Kapiti Coast Council decides. We're happy to say that. So in this debate, we have 2 points. First, I'm going to look at why we think the fact that the status quo has failed is obvious, right? But my first point is going to be why we don't think we're ready to move to full legalisation, why we're justified in saying that that would be harmful. But then my second point is going to be why our model is going to empower communities, produce better results for those communities, better reflect the freedom we think that we should try and maximise when writing government policy, but also explain why there'll be flow-on benefits for the nation as a whole and possibly for the world as we look to develop better models for the regulation and sale of currently illegal narcotics. So on to my first point. Why are we currently not ready? And the first point here is that drugs aren't really, legal anywhere in the world, right? Even the Netherlands, they've only decriminalised drugs. Those drugs are still being supplied by illegal gangs, right? And we say that Colorado, states in America have just started legalising marijuana, but even there, no one's quite sure the best regulatory model to use, the best way to minimise harms that can be associated with the sale of drugs. And certainly harms can exist, right? Like we all agree that alcohol should be legal, but no one's going to deny that there are immense harms potentially associated with the consumption of alcohol. Underage students scull bottles of vodka and die. There's immense amounts of violent behaviour, sexual crimes that happen while people are drunk and in drunk environments. Those are risks that are also associated with other illegal drugs. We say the state does have a role, and the question is things like how much you should be able to buy, who's allowed to grow it, should we have vertically integrated monopolies as Colorado's done, or should we enforce separation so you can't grow the marijuana that you're selling? These are all questions that matter tremendously in terms of limiting those harms, and so we say that those are still open questions. We think it's really good if we give communities the choices and we don't just move to a full legalising system. We also think there are cultural questions around the use of drugs, questions of restraint. We think that when drugs are consumed in an illegal environment, it self-selects for people that don't necessarily show a lot of restraint, and there isn't, because it's done in secret, you don't have wider culture enforcing a culture of restraint and moderation, right? Often people, get high to get really high, right? There's less of a concept of like, a little joint in the afternoon in the same way that you might have a glass of wine after work. So we say there's a necessity to build cultural change. Why are we happy to say that communities are the best ways to do this? Well, the first thing we say is that we like maximising freedom, right? So we think that this is an opportunity to make people more free, rather than have the state as a whole make the decision, local communities where individuals have much more ability to influence, policy can actually have more of a say in terms of drug policy. Also, because we have natural groupings of people, like a lot of old people retire in Waikanae and a lot of young people live in Wellington Central, we say that those natural groupings means that the policies are more likely to reflect the preferences of the people that live in those regions. So that's really good. And then finally, people have the option to move, right? Like, it's a big ask to move to Holland for your marijuana habit, but it's much more reasonable to move down from Kapiti into Wellington or vice versa for marijuana, right? Or if you really love drugs, that's a much more reasonable ask. So we are preserving a much greater degree of individual freedom. But then onto this laboratories of democracy point, right? So what are the benefits here? We say that different communities can try out different models. For example, right, and one example that's currently in place with alcohol that all of you that went to Easters in Invercargill a few years ago know, is that Invercargill has the Invercargill Licensing Trust. So the Invercargill, or the Southland Council, owns every single liquor store in Southland. Alcohol's a bit more expensive down there, but they use that money to fund community events, and that's something that the culture's happy with because there's not much to do in Invercargill other than go and watch netball or cycling, and so they're really happy to have like awesome cycling and netball facilities funded with alcohol money, plus the higher price helps limit some of the harm caused by all the drunk farmhands on weekends. That's a model that's working for them, and we're very happy for them. We think it's great that other communities can endorse that degree of experimentation and adopt models that are going to be best for them. So we say that, and then eventually we think the state, in a large number of years, can look at what the various communities have done and find out what works the best, which communities have the least harm, have adopted a model that's really working, and so they can say that's the best way to regulate and deal with this particular substance. That's what we want to do. Mr. Speaker, we believe it's important to maximise freedom, but it's also important to limit harm. This model strikes the balance we propose.
Thank you very much, Nick. Just for the speaker's info, I'll give the first clap of 4. Now turning to the opening speaker for Auckland, Josh Baxter.
Well, that was a lovely speech about legalising drugs. And we're not opposed to a national government having a full public policy discussion about how it wants to treat drugs. Our problem is that when you make councils have this choice, not only do you poison the council politics in that area, but you create strong trafficking incentives and incentives for people to come in and take drugs or traffic drugs without any enforcement mechanisms that are available at a higher stake. We say that when you have a low price of drugs in Kapiti and a high price of drugs in some other town nearby, maybe Christchurch, who knows where Kapiti is, there's no incentive for those drugs to go from Kapiti to Christchurch, where there is absolutely no incentive or no state resources to police the use of those drugs, and that's when you get the highest level of harm. Let me tell you first about why this creates an enormous drug problem in areas that are opposed to this kind of legislation and never consented to it, and then second, I'll explain why it's better and more principled, and you get a better policy discussion at a national level. So let's look first at why this creates an enormous drug problem in areas opposed to legalisation. And for that team's case to succeed, they needed to accept that some areas will be more amenable to having drug reform than others. There'll be some areas that legalise it, and some areas that keep it criminal. What does that mean? It creates very strong incentives to traffic drugs from one area to another. Because in the place where it's legal, it's going to be low cost. There's low risk in selling your drugs. It's totally legal. You're able to manufacture them or sell them or import them as you like. But in another area where it's still criminal, the types of people who continue to sell drugs like they do today are gangs. They're groups of people who take a high risk for what they do, and there's a high level of cost for those drugs when they're sold. That creates a very obvious problem, which is that there is now a very strong incentive to take drugs from the cheap place to the expensive place. They said, well, we're just going to put all sorts of regulations on who can take these drugs and who can sell them and what age and how many. The problem is we already have all sorts of restrictions on the chemicals or precursor materials to use those drugs. But those kind of restrictions, as we see, are already somewhat ineffective, given that we have drugs at the moment. At the point at which you try to impose like maximum limits on the amount that someone can have drugs, you get the same types of problems we have at the moment, but far, far worse. Because everyone gets their small share of drugs and buys it every day, and then sells it to a gang who then goes and sells it for enormous costs down the line. Or you just get fraud, or you get robberies, or you get all of the problems associated with drugs, but far worse because they're legal and there's more available and there's far many of them to take. What does that mean? It means people in councils who never wanted drugs, they didn't want gangs in the area, they didn't want junkies on the road, to have to live with a drug problem that is unbearable. But it's far worse this time, because there's far more drugs, which means there's more likely to be more gang turf warfare. There's lots of money in it, there's lots of opportunity. Gangs are likely to fight over turfs in these cities that didn't want them, and that means that they have to suffer all the harms of violence, the enormous health problems, all the things they didn't want in the first place. That would be fine if they consented to it, but the truth is they didn't. What makes this worse is that it is impossible or very difficult for councils to be able to enforce this, which makes those problems worse. They don't have the resources that I'll talk about in a second. Just the problem of having this trafficking problem creates two issues in the long run. The first is, it makes very dysfunctional national and local government politics, because councils and MPs are constantly at war with each other because they are very, very angry that they have stuck with a drug problem that they never wanted. That means that they're unlikely to get along at a policy level, they're unlikely to cooperate. It means that local government meetings are totally dysfunctional and there's very little progress in any other area. Second, it means there are enormous costs to the council that legalise them. Because the truth is, to legalise and have all the enforcement mechanisms they want costs a lot of money, and there are a lot of health problems. And it's unlikely that the average national voter in the general public who doesn't want drugs is going to want to spend all their tax money on the national system providing health care to these people who are inflicting harm on themselves with council that legalise them which they never wanted to. Which means that local council has to pick up the tab. We say what that does is create more political resentment in that area. It means that people are likely to have very dysfunctional local government politics because of the types of campaigns that are waged only on drugs. Let's talk about why it's better at a national level. As an extension of all the things I've talked about, this creates enormous dysfunction within the council itself. Who runs for local council? Old women and JPs, old men, retired pharmacists. Those are the people at the moment who run for local government. The problem is, very few people vote in local government at the moment. But when they have one enormous power to legalise drugs in comparison to all the small but important powers they have, like collecting rubbish and making streetlights work, people only vote on the issue of drugs. What does that mean? It means that you get an incredibly dysfunctional local council that never does any of the other functions it's supposed to do. Councillors and voters are constantly at war about what the council should be doing with drugs, but all the other important things that we have that council does never gets any attention. Secondly, enforcement. The truth is that if you're going to put all these strong limits on selling and so on, and on trafficking, they become very difficult for council to enforce. Council can't stop and search every car that leaves its area. It's not like a state that can check you as you go on a plane. The truth is that in order to implement this effectively, it would be incredibly expensive. We think the types of councils that are likely to legalise it are also unlikely to want to have people who want to spend all the money on that. What does that mean? It makes it even easier to traffic, and it means that there are a whole lot of drug-related harms, such as health problems, such as gang fighting. The national government's far better to make that decision because it creates an entire policy framework over an entire country that is able to deal with drugs. It can implement health reforms which our councils don't currently have. They don't have power over our healthcare system. They don't have drug police to crack down on all of these things. We say what that creates is a national drug problem that cannot be solved. We say that the state has a duty to protect people. We say that when the state does this, you get a better policy discussion because different parties campaign on different platforms. You have the Ministry of Health and other public officials, many of whom are in this room, making decisions and making recommendations about how we should best implement that. Local councils as bureaucrats who are highly inefficient and no policy area expertise in that area. This debate's about creating a national drug problem. It's not about creating a local. It's about creating a national drug problem that they have to stand for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh. We now welcome up Jody to continue the case for Victoria.
Josh never wanted to deal with in today's debate is that we have a harmful drug culture. A drug culture where the only people that you can buy it from are gangs. The only place that money can go to is criminal enterprises. What we present you with is an alternative. An alternative that can change negative cultures around the way that we use drugs and can funnel that revenue and that choice into communities to be empowered to do better for their own citizens and to make choices about the lifestyles that they want to live. Firstly, I'm going to deal with this point that Josh had about trafficking and about gangs. And secondly, I'm going to tell you why it is that we think our model is actually really good for empowering these local communities and for dealing better with the drug problem. So firstly, what did we hear from Josh? Josh told you that essentially this was going to lead to trafficking because people had better access. There's a couple of points that Josh just failed to recognise. The first thing to say here is that we always recognised that there was going to be a little bit of overflow. Why wouldn't we not worry about the overflow, right? For two reasons. Firstly, because we were limiting the amount that each individual could get, right? So there is literally no reason why you would drive to Wellington to take your 1 ounce back to Catholic to sell it off for $5 to the other person who lives there, right? We think that within reasonable limits, obviously, it's going to be very difficult to make any money via that model, right? The second thing to say is that we think the kinds of communities where people use drugs are the kinds of communities where it will be legal, so it will be cheaper there, right? So all of the students who live in Wellington will buy the cheap drugs from the Wellington local council that will have decided that that's okay. And we think of a couple of grannies from Waikanae where it's illegal, come down to Wellington and manage to sneak back their drugs to Waikanae and smoke it in the garage. We're perfectly happy with that model because we don't think that there are any harms to that. Second point about gangs, right? We think that we undercut the majority of their supply chain, right? Because we provide competition in a market where it's different. What did they essentially tell you? Essentially what they told you is that we should have gangs that exist that go to Dunedin and get alcohol and take it back to Invercargill because it's more expensive, right? The point is, there's not enough profit in that, and the second thing is that in order to get that profit, you have to be the sole provider of the supply chain. We think we undercut all of that. People prefer to deal with legal markets than they do in illegal markets. That's why we undercut gangs. What did we tell you about why it is exactly that we think that this is a more beneficial system? The first thing that we told you is that we think that it helps to build beneficial drug cultures, right? So to the extent that you want to talk about cultures about gangs, cultures about harms, we think we actually solve a lot of those problems because we think we're able to have a partial model where people learn restraint when they're living in Wellington in their 20s. They learn to restrain themselves in a model that says it's okay, but also regulates the way in which that behaviour happens. The second thing we gave you is that we think it actually is a really good model for regulatory frameworks, right? For working out what things causes certain harms, right? And we think we've seen that exactly with the legal high industry, right? There is a lot of debate about exactly what is and isn't okay. We think that we're moving to a better model under our system where we can essentially allow local communities to try them out for themselves, to minimise the harm to that community and to figure out the best way to deal with those harms and the best way to internalise any externalities there are. No response to any of that analysis. So what did they want to talk about? They wanted to talk to you about local communities and why it was that these local communities would be undermined. We've got three responses to this. Firstly, we think that this will actually increase buy-in into local councils because young people are now going to be interested in the issues that local councils deal with, right? They're no longer the stupid people that deal with rubbish and sewage. They actually deal with issues that people care about. And exactly like in Invercargill, we think that over time, this just becomes a natural issue that the council has always dealt with, right? So it gets lumped in there with all of the other issues. So if you want to talk about drugs, you also have to talk about rubbish, or probably something a little bit more exciting than rubbish because nobody really wants to talk about that. But the second thing we say is that actually we give local councils lots of money, right? They can tax these drugs and they can choose to use that to maybe pay for the excess health costs that they might get, but we don't think they're going to get, right? We think that they can use that to fund community events, cultural things, drug parks where the people can go so they don't annoy the old grannies who live next door. We think all of that is extremely beneficial to those communities. The final thing to say is that we think we do get less health problems and things like that for these communities because we don't have that black market, right? We don't have those drugs that were cut with other types of drugs that cause young people to go into a shop. We don't have the kinds of systems where people are buying unclean, using unclean needles from gangs. All of those types of things are minimised under our system, so we think that there are going to be less health costs. We think that as natural groupings of people who share similar views and similar thoughts move more towards this model, the rest of society becomes less scared of something that they realise is able to be regulated and controlled in this way. We think that eventually this will lead to the end of the war on drugs, a solution that is beneficial for these communities and a solution that suits them and not themselves. That deals with all of Josh's point about political capital, about the local government and the council fighting with each other, because actually we think that a lot of these local councils are going to be good for the government, right? They're going to show that these kinds of things can work, or alternatively, the government is giving them control over this, so we don't think there's going to be the kind of adversarial relationship that Josh wanted to tell you about. We also think that local councils are actually really important feedback mechanism for government, right? We think it's really important for the young people of Wellington to be able to signal to the government that they want to legalise drugs when that's something that they have to vote for certain political parties to do so, and they don't necessarily want to do that. We're very happy to say this is a beneficial model we are proud to propose.
Thank you very much to Jodie. We now welcome up the second speaker for Auckland One, Jess, to deliver.
Mr. Speaker, they want to talk to you about increasing individual choice, and they want to talk to you about decreasing the harms of drugs on communities. The problem is that the many council referenda we're having have massive impacts on the surrounding council jurisdictions, which in many instances have likely voted against decriminalising drugs. That means that those people have no choice. The choice of the neighbouring jurisdiction is imposed on them because the ability to prevent trafficking is so small. But secondly, there's no way to improve the lives or the harms of drugs in those communities. They want to talk to you about councils having more money from tax and therefore being able to deal with the problems of drugs. But the problem is, those problems don't just develop in the council area that now has more money. They also develop in the neighbouring jurisdiction who hasn't elected to decriminalise drugs and who isn't taxing and selling those drugs and who doesn't have the money to protect from those harms. So you don't actually get more freedom, you get other people's choices imposed on other jurisdictions, and you don't decrease the harms because the harms arise in council areas that don't have that tax revenue. So let's talk about two things. Firstly, how this in fact removes choice, and secondly, what the impact will be on the way in which you live and local council elections. Let's talk about the removal of drugs. It's inherent in their model that some communities will not want to do this, and it's quite obvious the types of communities we're talking about. There are plenty of them. If you look at rural communities, if you look at mostly white or elderly communities, we think that it's clear that many will not. We think that the outcome is consequently, it's obvious that there's going to be a lot of movement of drugs between areas. Why is that? We say it's very difficult for council jurisdictions to have clear borders. We say under the status quo you have no idea whether you're in Waitakere or in Auckland Central. You may move from it from one street to the other. There's no delineated border. We say that there's also no inherent obvious border. We say the way that states are arranged is normally borders are along sea lines or along geographical boundaries like mountains or something, mountain ranges or lakes or something like that. So it's easy to for governments to act to both tell their citizens where that line is, but secondly to regulate that line. We say that secondly, national governments have the power to regulate these lines. Local councils don't have their own armies or militia or police forces or masses of resource that they can put in to stopping that trafficking and to stopping gangs with masses of money and resources and weapons. So we say that councils aren't in a position to regulate those very porous borders that they have under the status quo. And we don't want to see the kind of massive weaponisation of councils that would be required to try and limit the gangs. What do they say in response to this? They say that little regulations, like stopping people from buying more than a couple of ounces of whatever, will limit this. We say it's probably pretty obvious to you what you would do in this situation. If you can go a couple of blocks over and sell, or a couple of councils over, and sell your weed for 4 or 5 times the price, because there it's illegal, you just tell your friends to buy some for you, right? It's not that hard. So you get 30 of your friends to buy their allocated ounce or whatever and give it to you. You get your family to do it because the revenue is high. Pretty easy to get around that one. But secondly, we say that the vendors you're talking about have an incentive to sell people more of those drugs because they're making money off it. So the reality is you're probably going to get around those regulations the same way underage school children currently do with alcohol. So we don't think those regulations are very clear. They're painting polarised communities where you're going to get some with a lot of drug freedom and some without it. The outcome is you're likely to get a lot of profit by selling it in another area, and it's relatively easy because all you're doing is driving across an unclear boundary that isn't particularly well enforced. We say that secondly, the reason enforcement won't be so great is because it is just simply so ridiculous. We say when you can take some beers to your friend's party, but you can't take your weed because they live a suburb over or a block over, that is such a ridiculous enforcement mechanism. And they told us that it was a ridiculous enforcement mechanism where they were like, we don't care about the grannies taking their weed back to Waikanae or wherever they're going. So we say that it's unlikely to be enforced because it's seen as so inherently wrong or inherently illegitimate in the first place. We think it's made worse by the fact that the local council doesn't even have the ability to police that. So what's the outcome? The first outcome is others' votes are defining your life. It doesn't matter whether you are voting clearly against drug use. What people in neighbouring council jurisdictions are doing is defining your life. And you have no way of changing that. You have no local MP you can lobby to stop that vote. You have no vote to weigh in on that. You have no way to have your voice heard because your voice is irrelevant. It's only the people in Auckland City Council that count, even though the impacts happen to you in Waitakere. So we say that that actually leads to a lack of freedom and a lack of accountability the way we want to talk about. But secondly, we say it leads to no improvement in terms of the gang issue. In fact, it's easier for them to access these drugs. It's easier for them to drive halfway across the country and sell it in Southland from whatever at the top of the South Island or whatever. And then consequently, you've got the same incentives on the dealers. The same incentives apply when you've got these regulations to buy small amounts, for example, to cut it, to dilute it with other things, to make that drug as dangerous as it is under the status quo. So we don't think you get the benefits they want to talk about under that model. We just don't think it apply. Now let's talk about the harms to local council elections, because we say that Jodie failed to deal with a lot of our material here. We told you that there is a reason for local councils who need to have day-to-day regulations and impose the way communities work and have a mandate on that. That in national elections, these issues get overshadowed and regional transport plans aren't the prime issue, which is why we have local council elections in the first place. We say this will be ignored when it is simply a referendum on drugs. When you're an old lady and you cannot vote to have a better functioning community or a better transport plan because you are always going to vote against drugs. We say you lose all purpose of local councils in the first place. If you want a referendum, then you just have a national referendum. Mr. Speaker, if you want to stand for safety and choice, you should oppose.
Alright, we now move into the reply section, so we swap sides and we welcome back the negative reply speaker, Josh.
imagine that Waitakere City Council legalised drugs and the cost of an ounce of pee was $30. Let's also imagine that the people of Auckland more broadly did not legalise the pee and the cost remained at $300. What happens next is very obvious. There is a strong incentive to traffic. And what happens when every person gets a certain allowance each day is there's an incentive on a gang member to pay 30 people the price of their cost of an ounce and ship it and transport it to an area. That is when you get the same cost of splicing drugs, of gang violence, of turf wars, of all the social ills that team tried to prevent. But the problem is, it all happens to people who never consented, who didn't want drugs in their area. And Jodie's only response to this was extremely glib. She just said, oh, well, it would be really hard to traffic because we have so many enforcement mechanisms. By a local council who has no police or any means of actually implementing this, who has no border security or any apparatus of the state. That team had to do better to respond to our case, Mr. Speaker. First, the drug problem. Second, political outcomes. The drug problem. There will be people who don't consent to this. There will be regions in this country where people don't want a drug problem on their footstep, so they legalise it. But there's no way we can stop the drugs going there. All the harms of this policy move from the area that was fine with it to the area that was worse with it. That's worse, because it means that the people who want drugs bear none of the costs, and the people who don't want drugs bear all of the costs. We were never willing in this debate to stand for that kind of cost being transferred to these people, to the enormous issues of health, to the enormous issues of family destruction and violence. Fine, if you want that, that's fine, but these people don't, and that's not reasonable. We talked to you about the types of problems with local councils. We told you about enforcement. We said a national government has policy analysts and has the ability to have a state apparatus to search cars, to make sure that all of these enforcement mechanisms are in place. But they open the door to fraud. They allow sellers to claim that 30 people bought 30 ounces rather than just selling 30 ounces to a gang. They open the door for, there to be violence in another area without that council being able to track down the people who caused that harm. That team were never able to deal with the enormous problems that they created. Let's talk about political outcomes. We talked about the anger that happens when one council is lumped with the burden of another. We said it makes it impossible to do all of the regional development issues and create infrastructure that a council needs to do. Because now, the only mandate received is the issue of drugs. The truth is, people don't tend to vote for local councils. And there's always going to be a very polarising situation. That team wanted to paint all of Kapiti as being one type of person, or all of West Auckland as being one type of voter. But the truth is there are lots of different voters in those areas, and each one of them is going to have a different view. There's going to be a polarising issue that swamps local council politics and prevent them from doing anything. Their two responses? Oh, well, they'll just become ordinary council business. That will never happen. It will never become ordinary council business because there will be individuals in that community who are so desperately opposed. Their next response was money. We A, don't think they'll get any money because there's enormous incentives to defraud the people who are selling these things and not report it and no way to enforce that. But B, we see that people who bear all the costs get none of the money and bear all of the harms. So your money point doesn't respond to our case. This debate was about a group of people who will suffer because of an illegal drug problem that they cannot solve, where there is no resources and no infrastructure to avert that enormous problem we oppose.
All right, he's already up there, so a big clap for the final speech of the debate.
Mr. Speaker, drugs can be really, really fun. But the availability of drugs in the community can also cause harms. And whatever system of regulating or banning drugs we have, there will be some harms. And that's why it's so critical in a debate about drugs, that you actually have two systems to compare. The problem with the negative side of the House is they were never actually clear what they supported in this debate. If they want to support the status quo, they needed to get up here and explain why they're okay with impurities or people overdosing because they don't know the strength of the drug, why they're okay with gangs, why they're okay with the culture of excess. They never did that, so let's assume, although they never explicitly told us, that they do in fact want national legalisation, right? Why is that a problem? Well, Jess spent a lot of time talking about how it was terrible that there was going to be overflow, that we were taking away choice from communities. If you're legalising drugs nationally, that's like the ultimate taking away choice for people that don't want drugs, right? At least under our model in Waikanae, even if there's some overflow, at least they can make it illegal to possess the drugs there, so there's some disincentive. They can ban all the like marijuana shops from their communities at least, and so they do have that much greater level of control. If you think that we value choice and we value the ability of communities to decide, that's why you need to devolve power, right? That it was a great analysis we brought you that they never dealt with on a principled level and instead supported unclear, one rule for all without being exactly clear what that rule was. 3 issues in the specifics of the debate. Firstly, trafficking, right? They never dealt with our analysis at all about how there was never going to be that much demand for trafficking because the high demand areas were the ones that would legalise drugs and the low demand areas would be the ones that wouldn't. I said that at first act, right? They had 12 minutes to talk about it and they never got there. That's really important, right? And so we're happy to say trafficking's not going to be a big deal. So the next point was gangs, right? That's a big benefit to us. We eliminate gangs. You need to obtain precursors, get a P-lab organised, and then run an entire distribution network. You need a large, centralised criminal organisation. When your friends and family in Josh's words can go to the head shop and buy the pot, you don't need a gang, right? That's the point. Let alone the fact that if you have all these people that you know that want drugs, they likely live in the same place as you, and you're all allowed to smoke drugs together, and it's amazing, right? And they never actually talked about the harms of a little bit of overflow. Like, they said, oh, it's terrible, they'll have to deal with all these problems. What are these harms, right? These are legal, regulated drugs. Why are they so bad? They never told us anything with that. What they want to talk about was, like, Josh obviously loves local body politics. But the thing is that, like, he's one of, like, 3 people in the entire Auckland region, right? No one cares about local body politics. No one votes for them. There's no buy-in. That's part of the reason why, like, rates are skyrocketing and local bodies do whatever the hell they want. We think it's fantastic if we can get buy-in from the disenfranchised people in local communities who aren't otherwise interested. He's right, oh, it'll be really controversial, right? Firstly, we said, like, controversy is fine, right? It's good if a community is having an open debate about how to solve a problem within their community. We're happy to stand for that. The second thing we said is, like, if you look at alcohol is like a massive issue in society, but Southland managed to solve the ILT issue. Like, there's not a huge drama there. We're happy to say the same would happen for drugs. Mr. Speaker, it's really hard to win a debate if you're not going to stand up and actually stand for something. We've done that on the affirmative side of the House. We'll see you in the
I thank the teams for the debate, so if everyone chats quietly amongst themselves.